Before we dive into our Torah study topic for today, which again is going back to the soul trait of bitachon, and actually there's no one else in this room, so I'm going to take this off for the time being. Let us together say our prayer over Torah for immersing ourselves with words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah hafok ba la'asok b'divrei Torah yedai dai 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 yedai dai 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 yedai dai 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 yedai dai dai dai. Wonderful. So we've studied bitachon, this week's kind of midah, soul trait, at least once before, possibly twice. And just wondering from our past studies what you remember about this idea of bitachon, of trust in God. We can look at just a couple of texts to spur our memory a little bit. So here we have a quote from Rabbi Yosef Yozel Horowitz, say that 3 times fast, right? Talking about this trait of bitachon. Does anyone want to read this text? Is that big enough? Yeah, Rabbi Catherine, thank you.
Internalizing the attribute of bitachon, trust in God, leads to 2 benefits. First, he who trusts in God is freed from all the troubles of the world. He is spared the emotional fragmentation caused by overly intense involvement in too many worldly concerns. He is also saved from wearing himself out, body and soul. Second, he has acquired the habit of trust, a path and a course in life. The direction that one has in this world is even more important than the benefits to which it leads. The advantages gained through bitachon are only indicators of its supreme value and by no means its only measure.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Catherine. And of this, Rabbi Bache Ibn Bakuda, in his book, The Duties of the Heart, he outlines some of these advantages of cultivating this idea of trust in God, and says they include freedom from worldly cares, the peace of mind that comes from not having to travel on faraway roads, which is so physically ruinous and menacing, an easy profession that earns him a good reputation, which allows him enough leisure time to reflect and fulfill his obligations in Torah study and do all the things that he must do. Few professional cares, even when his product does not sell, when he cannot collect money owed him, or when he becomes ill. He is pleased with everything, even if it goes against his grain. Just kind of looking at these early texts of bitachon, what do you make of it? Do you kind of connect with something that's in here? Do you have any questions or hesitancies about any of it?
Sometimes I become a little closed-minded when I hear someone say either to me or to someone else, well just trust, just trust in God. Almost like it's a perfunctory kind of thing, and it requires no thought. So what I'm taking from Musar study is I like the notion of practicing it, even if I don't believe it in that moment. But the practicing, the doing the trust makes me yearn. And oftentimes I do trust when I least expect it. So I have trouble. Anyway, I guess I said enough. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, there's a conflict that you're pointing to, Marla, that we're actually going to get to a little bit later. It wasn't within the text that we studied for today. It wasn't in the Musar Torah commentary. It's something that I'm bringing in from elsewhere, but it is very much present, even if it wasn't named explicitly, this conflict between us acting to produce the result that we want and trusting that it will happen.
That's what I was going to say, that I remembered from previous studying. I'm not taking the Musar class, but I remember it's trust and action, acting in godly ways or God's ways. That is, both are important, not one necessarily. So I'm agreeing for sure with Marla and with the action part.
Yeah, if we remember too, and Michael, what you said reminds me of this. Within Musar, there's this idea of a trajectory, right? Like there's this line, and if we go too far in this direction, it leads to problems. If we go too far in this direction, it leads to other problems. And the goal is to find something in the middle. And so the question with bitachon is, what do these two sides represent? Where does the trouble lie? If we have too little bitachon, what's the problem there?
We have a couple of possible problems. One is no trust. And the other is that you get your tail so tied in a knot that you just are ineffective.
So you could just get completely stuck.
Right.
You can feel helpless. You can feel hopeless, that kind of a thing. You go too far in the other direction. And what about the other way? What if we have too much bitachon? What's the problem there?
You lack effort in doing it because you're like, oh, it's okay, God will do it. I'll just fine. I'm not going to do anything. Just sit there and not do anything at all. No action. So
yeah, that's that story. You're the guy waiting to be saved, and God sends a boat, and He sends a
Right.
Yeah, I think you could become complacent, and the other guy will do it. In this case, this higher power, God will do it. And I, going back to what Michael recalled, this whole notion of being responsible and taking action and doing the hard work, probably living is a hard job of all of the jobs that we have. And to do it well, we have to really practice it.
What's that saying? God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Frank. Do you want to say something?
yeah, I was just going to say, when it says caused by overly intense involvement in too many worldly concerns, and I can get that way real quick. And what I have to remember is that I'm usually thinking still about myself. When I'm thinking about world problems or telling somebody off or getting involved in some other conflict, it's always really subconsciously and fully about me. So if I stop thinking about myself, like stay, like the STAY, stop thinking about yourself. If I could do that, then I can stick with these other things. You know what I mean? I could trust in God because, I'm kind of staying out of the way with my ego and letting God use me to help in the way He wants me to help and not the way Frank wants to help. I don't know. Sorry, I'm getting a little too animated.
You couldn't possibly, Frank. I love it. And I think what you're also pointing to is how intertwined all of these different midot are, right? When we work on one of them, we find ourselves working on others as well. That's beautiful. That's a really wonderful thing to come into this with, I think. And I'm sure that it will relate to the story that we're really diving into from this week's Torah portion, which has so many different angles, right? We know for the past couple of weeks, we've been studying about everything that Joseph went through, from being a young boy who was really not liked by his brothers. That's an understatement considering what they did, right? To all the trials and tribulations that he dealt with as a slave, as a prisoner, and then finding his way and then reconnecting with his brothers and what that would look like, which is what happens in this week's Torah portion, and just how he handles all of that. And also, as we get to in this week's Torah portion, how his brothers handle the reality in front of him that, hey, after all these years, your brother is there. You can't just walk away or ignore what happened years ago, right? So what I love about this particular Musar Torah commentary is that it really gives us the ability to connect and to wrestle with the idea of trust, bitachon, through Joseph's eyes, surely, but also through the eyes of other members of the family. So that's what I want to do now, is to give us the opportunity to dive into our text. Oh, but there was this one thing I had to bring in because I thought it was so interesting. This is from Breshit Rabbah, which is Midrash based on the book of Genesis, that says Yosef was nicknamed a dancing man because of his intense faith in God. Because he had emunah, faith, and bitachon, trust in God, Joseph did not sink into, into depression. Instead, he beamed with joy to the point of dancing. In the face of controversy, what did he do? He leaned into his faith and his trust. I don't know, does anyone have any response to that? I thought it was such an interesting way of kind of visualizing this text. Well, as we go through it, we'll see if that speaks to us or not. Really, what I want to do is start right here. This is the very beginning of this week's Torah portion, starting with Genesis 44. Does anyone want to read the first few verses here, just as much as you feel comfortable?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Michael.
Then Judah went up to him and said, "Please, my lord, let your servant appeal to my lord, and do not be impatient with your servant, you who are the equal of Pharaoh." My lord asked his servants, "Have you a father or another brother?" We told my lord, "We have an old father, and there is a child of his old age, the youngest. His full brother is dead, so that he alone is left of his mother, and his father dotes on him." Then you said, that's it?
Sorry.
Okay, sure.
Sorry, Michael, I just wanted to make sure everyone knew. We're talking, of course, about Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, which is the only brother that he shares a mother with. The two children of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Then you said to your servants, "Bring him down to me, that I may set eyes on him." We said to my lord, "The boy cannot leave his father. If he were to leave him, his father would die." But you said to your servants, "Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, do not let me see your faces." When we came back to your servant, my father, we reported my lord's words to him. Later, our father said, "Go back and procure some food for us." We answered, "We cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us can we go down. For we may not show our faces to the man, unless our youngest brother is with us." Your servant, my father, said to us, "As you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone from me." And I said, "Alas, he was torn by a beast, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you will send my white head down to Sheol in sorrow. Now, if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, since his own life is so bound up with his, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will send the white head of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief."
Okay, so there's a few different things that are going on here. First of all, you might have the question of what is Sheol,
Yeah, I don't
right?
know.
And essentially, in Judaism, there is not the concept of hell, but Sheol is about as close to that concept as you can get. It is not like a permanent place of punishment or anything like that. It comes up in a few different texts. One of the more significant ones kind of relates to being in a place that is so alone that even God can't hear your prayers. It's like being in a kind of place that requires you to do deep thinking yourself so that when you emerge, you really have taken the time to do the reflection that's needed going forward. That's along the lines of what Sheol is. So, I mean, here Joseph is saying, or not Joseph, Jacob really would be in a deep, deep state of grief, of isolation, of feeling alone if something happened to Benjamin as well. So, of course, we know, and we started with this week's Torah portion. We didn't start with what had happened right beforehand. We know the story about how Benjamin came with them back to Egypt, and all of the brothers were there, and Joseph had one of the goblets placed in Benjamin's bag so that he would be found with it. Joseph would say, I'm going to take Benjamin as my slave as a punishment for the fact that he took this goblet. And now Judah is responding saying, no, take me, don't take him. This would kill my dad. This would give him a deep state of grief, and we can't have that happen. Now, if we're coming at this text from a state and from a framework of bitachon, there's so many things to wrestle with here, right? Where does trust exist within this portion? And some of the questions that came up in Rabbi Ted Reiter's piece on bitachon, some of them relate to the fact that Joseph keeps his identity hidden throughout this entire thing, right? He says the classic interpretation of this story is that Joseph keeps his identity hidden to test his brothers. Have they grown emotionally since selling him into slavery? Have they developed more compassion for their father, more fidelity toward their brothers, more integrity as men? This reading brings into question Joseph's bitachon. If he trusts that all will be for good, would he need to test his brothers? Just want to pause there. What do you think of that?
I think this seems to not come up very often, but he's holding all the cards here. And his brothers are really holding only the card of this youngest brother. And you also notice that there is only one wife, that his father says, this is my one wife. Well, what about the other sons? But I have always read this and I think, there is a part of him, human just like the rest of us, that wants to get back, that wants to test it, that it totally has control over when he will do what. And this goes back to a really crummy incident. It was a long time ago. You don't really know. He doesn't really know where the brothers stand right now. And the brothers have no idea who he is. So in a sense, they are being played or manipulated. And they're having to prove themselves. I don't know if they would look at it that way, but definitely Joseph is making them prove themselves over and over and over.
So you're saying it's not because he lacks bitachon, it's because he's angry and he wants to kind of put them through a little something.
Well, if we say bitachon is trust, you could look at this as Joseph is building his own trust. He had no reason to trust his brothers the last time he saw them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're giving him many reasons to trust them. Now, every time he tests them, they come through.
Interesting. So it's not that he lacks trust, but that this is an opportunity for building more of it.
for rebuilding the family, actually.
Anyone else have any thoughts here? This is a really big question.
Doesn't Joseph at one time try to play his brothers off of each other and try to see if one of them, that they stole something? Isn't there that part? Isn't there? So isn't there that test? There's something coming up, right?
Mhm.
No, that's exactly what this text is.
About
Mhm.
this, that part.
Planted the goblet in Benjamin's bag.
Gotcha.
Benjamin
Yes.
was now going to be a slave, and Judah says, not on my watch. Take me, don't take him.
Yes,
Mhm.
that's right.
Yeah, and Judah is absolutely fascinating here as a character. I'm going to be talking more about it tomorrow night, but it's just such an interesting thing. Yeah, and Marla, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I was thinking about trust in terms of contemporary times. When you're working with couples, they talk about if a trust has been broken, they make a choice. I can never trust you again. Well, then the result of that is that marital relationship, it can only be over. But if the person begins to question, can I trust you again? And sort of lets it slip in, some opportunities to trust. If you really want the marriage to work out, then maybe that's the way to go about it. It's acting as if you trust for the moment, hoping that your need to be trusted or to be able to trust will be fulfilled so that you can repair what's broken. And here's this, family of all these brothers. Oh my goodness, what a mess, right? So how do you put it together experientially? And you can't just tell them, like I said earlier on, just trust. You can't just say that. I think you have to have these experiences. So maybe that's why he's doing it,
That's what I think.
So it's not from a place of anger, rather it's an opportunity for people to show who they really are.
Uh-huh.
I mean, while he tests his brothers, there isn't anything that says he was so angry at them he had to walk out of the room. We don't see that. We do see the insecurity and the lack of trust.
Absolutely. And how could there not be with everything that happened?
I mean, his brothers, we aren't to that part then, but his brothers start to wonder how he can trust them once they find out who he really is.
Yeah. So it's also creating that opportunity. So what we're differentiating between is a trust in God versus a trust in other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Bitachon usually refers to a trust in God. So perhaps it has nothing to do with that and everything to do with opportunities to develop trust between humans. Well, then why don't we look a little bit further down, because the other questions here relate to Judah. Judah, if we remember, was the brother who stopped the other brothers from killing Joseph by throwing him into a pit instead, but who truly didn't do enough in order to save his brother because found out that he had been sold into slavery and God knows what had happened to Joseph, right? So here is Judah, who is kind of on the line here. Judah, who speaks up after Benjamin is found with his goblet, saying, no, you can't take him. And so the question that Rabbi Reiter poses, the question can be turned to the brothers as well. Mm-hmm. Is Judah expressing his bitachon in this moment? Does he know that Joseph will refuse his offer? Does he know that Joseph won't just say, okay, you can be my slave. I'm okay with that. Benjamin, go back. Judah, you're now a slave. Does he truly worry that leaving Benjamin behind in Egypt will cause the death of his father? Why does he not trust in God to provide help for Benjamin? What do you make of those questions?
I'd say everybody is gambling. but with no apparent background. Or
It's
at least no apparent background on the part of the brothers. Again, Joseph does, he's the one holding the cards. He does have information. And he has more information now that they have come back.
I was wondering if Joseph has any feelings, and if you were to saying, if his brother stood up for his brother now, why did he not stand up for him?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If he's standing up for his brother, why didn't he stand up for him when he was his brother? You know, I wonder if that's having something to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, the rabbis talk to exactly this. So there's such a parallel here, Frank, that you're like pointing to, right? And so the rabbis say that it's because of what happens when they didn't stand up for him that Joseph feels the need to test the brothers with Benjamin now. So it's kind of giving Judah an opportunity to respond differently, or the other brothers an opportunity to respond differently this time than they did many years before, to see, did they change? Did they repent? Are they any different? Michael and Marla, you temporarily unmuted and then muted again. Is there something that you wanted to say? No? Okay, I know this, the Musar scholars really across the board in so many places talk about how bitachon is the hardest of all of the different midot, right? This idea of trust is such a challenging thing to act, but also to think through. Like, it's so complicated. It's really hard to dive into, I think. Definitely is something that I struggle with as well. Why don't we look a little bit further down, and feel free, I can't see everyone, but feel free to jump in if you have any questions or anything you want to add to the conversation here. The last question, of course, that Rabbi Reiter asked was, can the brothers trust that they will really be safe in Joseph's care? This too becomes a test of their bitachon. And that's going to be reflected in this text that we're about to read. So essentially, right after this whole thing, right after Judah says, no, take me instead, that's when Joseph can no longer control himself. So it says, Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone withdraw from me. So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear. And so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to the brothers, I am Joseph, is my father still well? But his brothers could not answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come forward to me. And when they came forward, he said, I am your brother Joseph, he who you sold into Egypt. Now, do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been a famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come in which there will be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. Our bar mitzvah student on Saturday morning, Alex Asiag, is going to be talking a lot about this and the response that Joseph has and why he kind of lets his brothers off the hook right away. But let's just go back first, before we dive into that, to this question that had been posed by Rabbi Reiter of how do the brothers know that they can trust in Joseph and really be safe in his care? Do you think they have that trust? What does it take to build it?
I think your last words are what resonate with me, and the words to build it. They just can't trust for the sake of trust. Some things have to happen in your own brain, in your own heart, and maybe your life experiences as well, so that you can open the door towards trust. To me, it's a process, and it doesn't just happen because he said so. But I'm glad he said so, because that kind of opens the door a bit.
Yeah,
it opens the door to remember that thing where, I there have been little ways that Joseph has tested them that he also can go back to and say, and this and this. And we have, because this is so many years later, we really have a life and death situation here. Joseph doesn't, but the brothers and the father and all of that do. And so that is mixed in with there. It really is, we need food, you know, and they're kind of, I mean, think if this happened to you, to somebody in your family, and they showed up and you just sold them off as a slave years ago and you haven't heard from them since, you know, and other things have happened in life. I also think it's at the issue of the father and injuring the father and the father's grief, especially the father's grief, you know, is that nobody wants to see him die either.
Yeah, those words are really powerful, because if we look at the text, Rabbi Catherine, you bring this up, right? The last thing that he talks about, that Judah talks about before Joseph reveals himself, is that he's worried of what will happen to his father.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph certainly is on the same page there.
Mm-hmm.
The commonality. Any other thoughts or comments on this? I know there's so many different components to it. Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
So if their brothers were jealous, right? Because they were jealous of Joseph, his attention he got from his dad, the code, this at this time in their lives, they should be more jealous of him. Look at him now. But I think now they're so dependent on trying to live and trying to survive that they're willing to lose that jealousy and maybe have an awe to him instead of the jealousy they used to have. So maybe that works out in a way. Like when it's the last house on the block and you're going to starve to death, you're going to be okay with whatever, right? And so I think they have to trust him in that moment, just like we trust Hashem, you know? So.
Yeah, what's really interesting about what you're saying, Frank, is essentially you're bringing it back to the idea of anava, of humility, right? And there's a reason that all of our Musar teachers start always with anava, with humility, because until we're willing to come at things from a place of humility, we can't actually make progress in other places. And here the brothers are being humbled, and maybe that helps.
You know, can you hear me?
Yeah, good to see you.
Hi. So there's a couple of things that strike me is when the event first happened where they sold Joseph off, they were all much younger. You know, maybe they weren't all married yet. Maybe they hadn't had a child yet. Maybe they hadn't had experienced the fear and the loss of a child. So, you know, acting things out and tossing your brother into a well or to sell him maybe just really wasn't as significant as it becomes as they mature and become parents themselves, and then experiencing the grief of their father. Because what you hear in Judah's voice is this, and reflected in the brothers, is this incredible love for their father, you know, this overwhelming love for their father. The other thing that strikes me is that for human civilization to move forward at any level, you have to have a relationship with another human being. And in order to have a relationship with another human being, there's some element of trust that's built in, I think, sort of innately. Like, if I talk, can I talk to this person? What's going to be the result? Otherwise, it's murder and mayhem and everybody falling apart and killing each other. But, you know, there's that element too, which is what God wants us to be in relationship with him and with others, right? I mean, that's the way I always look at it. So.
Yeah, you're right. It's such a big part of our lives in general, and yet so difficult at times. Thank you for bringing all of that in, Misty. So I want to bring us back to one other piece here, and this is going back to what you were talking about earlier, Marla. So some rabbis teach that Joseph had actually made a mistake earlier on in the story, because we remember that Joseph had interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, and he had told the baker, "You're going to die," and he told the cupbearer, "You're going to be brought on back to your original position and you're going to, you're going to be fine. And both of these dreams came to be real. And as the cupbearer was leaving prison, Joseph said to him, keep this in mind, what I did for you. Okay. So there are some rabbis who teach that he should never have said that. They teach that he should have had more trust, bitachon, in God, that God would have taken him out of prison. And that had he not said a word, Joseph may have been released from prison immediately, but because he tried to intervene and he tried to get the cupbearer to remember him, he would end up in prison for an extra 10 years before his eventual release. It's an interesting way of looking at it, right? So I'm kind of curious, what do you make of this? Do you agree with this teaching here or not?
That's a really interesting position. How long has he been in Pharaoh's court at this point? Is he like in his 30s? Do we have any idea?
He was, I think, around his 30s is pretty accurate. I can't recall a place in the Torah, like around this point, where it says exactly how old he is, but based on other like numbers that are offered, it's got to be somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah, I think he's old enough that he's married and had 2 children. We've gone through the good years. So yeah, he's also matured and had to take on some things. There must have been, it's not really talked about, but all of a sudden this stranger is running the country. I mean, he had to have picked up some skill sets and ways of getting along with a large number of people who are not of his background and not of his religion.
Right. It's pretty remarkable.
I was going to say that along with the ideas of bitachon and the trust and faith, that and action, but in order to actually put into action, especially under the circumstances with spending more time in prison, he has to have courage to act upon what he really believes is the right way to go. And courage is, something that's really hard when the results of action are detrimental to the person doing the action. It's really very courageous to do it regardless.
Yeah, it's character.
I mean, that's what I think about with firefighters and other professionals that help strangers out of terrible circumstances that is also threatening to their own, well-being in our times.
I'm sort of struggling with this. I'm not very happy with this teaching somehow. Because it's hard to take back your words. And the suggestion here in asking us, do we agree with this teaching, is implying that he had that choice to take back his words. And yet I think his impulse to express himself, I can relate to it. Sometimes I talk too much and I want to share advice or something like that. And I'm doing it with good intention. I don't think it's because I lack trust in the person or lack trust in God. Sometimes I can't help myself. And then other times I do a far better job of keeping my mouth shut. And that was indeed a better decision when I've done that. But it's this balancing act. I think I deal with it all the time in terms of relationships with my family. And then even in my position as a lay leader in our temple, I have to think twice before I speak. And sometimes I screw up and I don't. But I'm well-intentioned. It just takes practice. So I don't know if I agree with this fellow or not, these rabbis.
Yeah, so I mean, there's here,
Yeah.
right, Marla? There's two different pieces here. One could be this punishment is ridiculously harsh, right? That like that's what you're expressing is like all he did was say, please remember that I interpreted your dreams for the future so that you can share that with others. That's all he said, you know, like to punish him by having him be in prison for an extra 10 years, that's pretty insane, right? The other piece of this is, should he have been punished for saying that at all? Was that actually wrong for him to have expressed in the first place? And what do you think? Was it wrong? Did it show a lack of faith or not?
It's like a salesman pitching their product. It was very practical. It was very real. And there was nobody else. I mean, why not throw that out there? What the heck?
Well, I can also think developmentally, the little toddlers that are in my life are now expressing themselves and say to me, I can do that. Don't help me. Don't do that. I can do it myself, Auntie Marla. I can do it. Well, I can't. I have to help myself and let them trip and fall or whatever. But sometimes I do say something, and I often say it more than once. Are you going to punish me for that? That's what would happen. That's what happened here. You know, I would have been better off had I not.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to be honest with you. I really struggle with this too. And it's part of the reason I brought it in is because it just seems so contradictory with some of the other teachings, right? If what we're talking about is this trajectory of bitachon, of on one end, we are having absolutely no faith and no trust, and that causes problems. On the other end, we have too much faith and trust, and so we don't actually give ourselves any responsibility. Well, look, we are supposed to take on some responsibility. What is so bad about him saying something here?
Right.
Just remember that I can interpret dreams. Let people know if they need to know. Give them my card. You know, like what's so bad here?
I know it. How does he come up with this 10 years deal? Is that one of those the rabbi made up a number of years?
Yeah, I'm not sure because I don't recall it saying 10 years in the text itself. I didn't look into why that specifically, but that is what the text said.
Yeah, it does say he forgot and that he didn't do anything right away, but man, he's really trying to cement his own place back in the court.
My only thing that I would say is that why he would maybe not say that he can interpret dreams is that maybe he's taken too much attention that, you know, if he can interpret dreams, that's from Hashem. Hashem gave him that gift. And maybe he's being arrogant in that and saying, I can interpret these dreams and maybe taking it more on himself. Then I don't know. That's just what I was getting out of it. Just to make an argument.
And if he just said, don't forget me, that's not like, hey, and I'm the dream killer guy, you know?
Yeah, but if we remember after this, when he's in front of Pharaoh, I mean, this happens after. He goes in front of Pharaoh and says that it's not him who interprets dreams. He merely acts out the dreams that, you know, like he merely gives voice to the interpretations that God gives him. So he displays a lot of humility there.
And the Pharaoh's already run through his own court and his own priests or whatever they're called, and they have not been able to do anything or interpret anything that has any kind of reality to it, I guess.
Yeah. So essentially, these same rabbis, they ask this question, which is whether bitachon, trust in God, trust that everything will in the end work out in the way that it's meant to. And hishtadlut, which is the act of doing something, like to actually be actively involved in making something a reality the way that you want it to be. Are these things in conflict? And here the rabbis are saying, yes, it is. Joseph speaking up is in conflict with bitachon. Do we agree? Is it always in conflict?
I don't agree.
Can you say more about that, Rabbi Catherine?
You heard me. I'm like, it's like, come on, rabbis, you guys do this stuff, It's like, yes, you do put it out there. You do what you can for yourself. And there often comes a point when you just need to, a lot of people would say, hope that things would do well. And if we put that in there, sometimes it changes how it's seen. But I mean, I'm at a point in my life where it's like, what? Okay, so so what's going to happen next and what's going on and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you put out some stuff and you wait to see what's going to happen. And, and I've had to learn to do that. I'm usually a beat my head against the wall kind of a person. It really comes to getting down to it. And it's hard to just say, okay, let's see what's going to happen next. I've done what I know how to do. And let's see what happens. And it's really hard. I think we're not talking about this, but it also is, there's a lot of stressfulness and a lot of difficulty and a lot of deciding that you're not going to insist that you get an answer right now today, that it's going to take a while, and why couldn't you both trust and wish?
That's a good question, right? Because what the rabbis are saying is that if by putting forward himself and saying, remember that I can interpret these dreams, he is saying that he knows how God wishes things to happen, and is furthering, like, the rabbis see it as a form of arrogance, of pushing forward one particular possibility when it should be up to God. But you can also argue, why not put it all out there, right, and trust that God will do what's needed to move things forward? Like, that I'm not going to get in the way by just saying, hey, remember me. Okay.
Right. And sometimes in saying, remember me, you remind yourself of what your abilities are.
Yeah, beautiful. So there's so much here to kind of play with. Any other comments on that before I go to these two different interpretations of bitachon? All right, so let's go to this. And this comes from our commentary for today. That there's one idea by the altar of Navardak, the Rabbi Yosef Yuzel Horowitz, that teaches that bitachon is a deep knowing that God delivers what we need in each moment. And from this perspective, Judah could have believed it would all work out for the good while he was speaking to Joseph. Okay, so that's one idea. The other hand, Chazon Ish, Rabbi Abraham Isaiah Karelitz, teaches that everything we experience in this world has greater meaning, even if it is not immediately or ever apparent to us. From this perspective, Judah could have believed that even if things would not work out for the immediate good, God would ultimately provide. So essentially, it's how short-sighted it is, how long-term it is. Which of these, if either of them, makes more sense to you, or do you connect with bitachon? Is it that God is looking out for us in each moment, or that God is looking out for us in the long term, even if in this moment it's not working out quite as well?
No, I'm kind of having to switch gears from Joseph to Judah, so I'm not quite there yet.
Sorry, yes, you're right.
I think it could be very disappointing to the individual to believe that God delivers what we need in each moment, especially if it's not what we want or is appropriate for our lives. But trust has to be tempered with what's really what we really need. I mean, I don't know. Rabbis are human beings, and with the exception of you, Rabbi Cassi, and and Rabbi Catherine. I mean, rabbis are humans, and there weren't psychiatrists and psychologists back then, and all human beings have a certain degree of insecurity and depression and such, right, at different times of our lives. So it's how to counsel others. How did they do it? All being human, how did they?
Yeah, I don't know how to look at this. There is an assumption here that Judah, in particular, maybe all of his brothers, but definitely this one, assumes that Judah had a strong belief in or relationship with or was taught a lot about God. But that is an assumption. It is not stated.
Yes, we
And
have
so
to look at the rabbis who spoke it, right? It would be absolutely insane for any major figure within the Jewish community to not have had that relationship, right? So that's kind of thrown on there because of the context.
I mean, we can see Judah's
Are they?
taking.
Oh, excuse me.
You know, Judah is the upcoming head of the family. When his father dies, that will be totally his position. So we do see his maturity in assuming that responsibility and taking the risk, many risks, of going down to Egypt and coming back. And this guy is kind of messing with them and not really, you know, this kind of an unusual situation. It's not an, I want to buy your grain. Okay, give us your money. Here it is. Go home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, what did you want to say?
Oh, are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I was just thinking I came in late, but are they expecting us, these rabbis, that we are to have blind trust? Is that, you know, is this what's going on here, that we should not experience things ourselves, you know, like, you know, make mistakes and learn from them and, you know, take some responsibility?
Right. I don't know if they're asking for blind trust,
Mm-hmm.
but this midah that we're focusing on is all about trust.
Mm-hmm.
Trust in God, trust in that ultimately we can make meaning out of whatever it is that's thrown our way. That's the idea here. And we don't necessarily all have to agree with that, but that definitely is like the way in which we're approaching this particular Torah portion through the Mosar commentary.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
In looking at these two rabbis, they lived about the same number of years, and they both experienced war, World War I, and then eventually the Korean War at the end of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering of what significance, if any, that their life experiences had on them interpreting what trust means.
Mm-hmm.
If their focus was purely on Torah, what was going on, that's one idea. But if indeed the humanness about each of them came out, those are pretty big life experiences.
And the truth is that nothing is ever just Torah, right? We bring ourselves to Torah. And so that absolutely has an effect on how they view the world. Mm-hmm. And the rabbis also talk about how you can never have bitachon unless you first have emunah. So unless you have faith and hope in a promising future, it's impossible to have bitachon, trust. So, I mean, I think we definitely could look at a situation in which there is so much war and destruction, and having faith and hope that there will be a more promising future, and then kind of putting that in bitachon, this trust in God that in the end, there will be good, even if right now it's kind of not so great. But it's a lot to wrestle. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Frank.
No, I'm so sorry. And this might jump off. So if you know, my favorite one of my favorite stories is David and Goliath. Is David going out to meet Goliath? Like how he still grabs the 5 stones. Like he knows God's got his back. He's pretty confident in this. But he still grabs 5, even though the first one works, because we're still human, right? We still have to trust. I trust, but I don't. Let me just bring a couple extra rocks. I might need them, right? Instead of thinking God's got me on this. And that's one of my favorite ultimate trust stories is we still bring the 4 other rocks. So,
Yeah.
sorry.
And according to the text earlier, that would be a problem, right? But I don't know that any of us here today actually see that as a problem at all.
On topic.
You know, that's where the discrepancy is. That's where some of that rustling is. It is 1:27. Okay, good. I only had 3 other texts here, so that's not so bad. Actually, I'm going to go to this one right here because this really spoke to me personally. I'm curious if it does to you as well. Says, while most world religions and traditions focus on perfection and deity like humans, Judaism recognizes that we all have our flaws, sometimes show a lack of integrity and perform actions we would prefer to ignore or hide. This is apparent in Vayigash too. Jacob, once the trickster, has been worthy of being renamed Israel and now of being reunited with his son Joseph. Jacob is redeemed from starvation, the crushing loss of his son, and perhaps even the anguish of knowing the truth that Joseph was sold by his brothers. Jacob, with all of his faults, is worthy of relationship with God and his place in the divine plan.
Down here.
The brothers are given descendants even after their mistreatment of Joseph, and Judah's mistreatment of Tamar, which is a whole other story that we're not getting into right now. Joseph is promised a lineage, even when indenturing Egyptians during the famine. These brothers too are worthy of divine guidance. The ultimate reason to live with bitachon may therefore be the knowledge that as flawed as you and I are today, we are all part of a divine plan for good.
Divine plan again.
Beautiful.
I know Larry is struggling there with this idea of divine plan and our own and fate versus personal choice, right?
Right. Last week. Right.
I mean, it's a big topic that comes up in so many different places. You're not alone in that struggle. I saw that happening on your face.
I trust in God. That is the biggest thing I can say. I trust in God. All else doesn't matter.
I think some of the questions that perhaps I'm hoping that we'll be left with today are just, what is the place of bitachon in our lives? Where do we find that trust and also emunah, faith in the future can help us in our day-to-day lives? How do they factor in? And where do they maybe not feel as appropriate, right? Are there places where we want to actually be active in creating the future that we wish to see? And it's okay to do that while at the same time having faith in something.
Yes, we are always partners.
So I know this is a particularly challenging midah. This is a particularly challenging text because it requires so much of us and so much honesty and truth. But I hope it gives us really good food for thought in the future. Next week, we will not be focusing on bitachon. I think just about any other midah is easier than bitachon. So I look forward to being with all of you next Thursday. Because I have a meeting that leads up to the exact second when this Torah class, actually, truthfully, it goes on an extra half an hour. It's going to be hard for me to do it multi-access just because I won't be able to greet people as they're coming in. So I think I'm going to keep next week's online only. And then the future week, we could do it as multi-access if people would prefer that. Awesome. I look forward to studying again with all of you soon. Have a great day.